The fluorescent lights hummed above sterile white corridors smelling of antiseptic and floor wax. Ashley Cooper moved through Oak Creek Memorial's ICU in Savannah with the invisibility she'd perfected over 3 years, competent enough to be trusted, unremarkable enough to be forgotten. Her badge read Ashley Cooper, RN, with no other designation, no military insignia, no hint of the classified after-action reports filed under a name that officially no longer existed. It was 6:38 a.m. on a Sunday. The skeleton crew had barely turned over from night shift. Ashley pushed through the ICU doors carrying a fresh cup of black coffee and a stack of patient charts, her movements precise and economical, the kind of efficiency that comes from operating in places where hesitation costs lives. She'd worn the same scrubs for 3 years, sage green, no patterns, nothing that drew attention. The only thing that didn't match was the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, stitched so carefully that no one had ever noticed it. She touched it once before clocking in, a ritual that took exactly 3 seconds. Room for 12 was her second stop on the rounds. The Delta Force colonel lay unconscious, his chest wrapped in surgical dressings that were 48 hours old. His name was Marcus's commanding officer. The man who'd written the letter promising to bring her son home safe after the Marger operation. She'd read that letter 7 times. 14 words, "I will bring Marcus home. You have my word as an officer." Those 14 words had kept her breathing for 6 months when the official casualty report arrived incomplete. The colonel had coded twice since the bombing shredded his chest cavity. Twice, his heart had stopped, and twice the ICU staff had dragged him back. His central line was running normal saline, a temporary measure until cardiothoracic could clear him for transfer to the surgical ward. His O2 sat was stable at 94%. His heart rate ran steady at 68, which for a trauma patient was almost miraculous. Ashley moved beside the bed without announcing herself, checking the monitors first, a habit from places where talking could get you killed. The colonel's eyes opened. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his pupils focused, and his right hand twitched. Trying to move. Wanting to move but unable to find the strength. "You're safe," Ashley said quietly. "You're at Oak Creek Memorial in Savannah, Georgia. You've been here for 3 days. You're stable." Her voice carried the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She adjusted the 4 rate on his pain medication without asking permission, 1 milligram morphine every 4 hours, timed with his breathing, which was exactly what he needed even if nobody had ordered it that way. Her hands moved like surgical lasers, steady and deliberate, pulling up his hospital gown to check the dressing beneath. Clean. No bleeding through. No sign of infection yet. The colonel's lips parted. He tried to speak. Nothing came out but air. "Don't talk yet," Ashley said. She touched his shoulder, not the left one, the left was where the blast had torn into him, and she kept her hand there for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough to mean something. Short enough to maintain professional distance. "Your commanding officer is going to want to see you standing. Let's get you there." She was reaching for the full lock when Dr. James Hargrove appeared in the doorway of room for 12. He was tall, built like someone who'd played college football and never stopped believing it mattered. His cardiothoracic scrubs fit too well. His dark hair was turning silver at exactly the right temples. He had the kind of face that convinced people he was smarter than he actually was, a face built for authority, not competence. He'd been at Oak Creek for 15 years, building a hierarchy so carefully constructed that junior residents trembled when he entered a room. "Morning, Dr. Hargrove," Ashley said, stepping back from the bed with her hands visible and empty. Deferential. Quiet. The way she'd learned to move around him. Hargrove didn't acknowledge the greeting. He was looking at the colonel's vitals on the wall-mounted monitor. His respiratory rate is elevated. 18 breaths per minute. Elevated but stable, Ashley said. He was alert when he woke. Trying to speak. Pain management might. "I didn't ask for suggestions," Hargrove said. He was already entering the room, already moving toward the forestand with the confidence of someone who'd never been questioned. He's been stable for 36 hours. We maintain the current regimen until I clear him for surgery. That's the protocol. Yes, doctor. But Ashley had seen the colonel's pupils in the moment before Hargrove walked in. She'd watched his breathing change when the pain hit him during the examination. She'd felt his hand clench involuntarily when she'd adjusted his dressing. The current pain regimen wasn't enough. Not for someone who'd survived 2 codes in 48 hours and was fighting through the muscle damage of a blast wound. His body was trying to communicate what his voice couldn't, and his respiratory rate was climbing in response to pain that wasn't being managed. She knew this with the certainty of someone who'd tended wounds in field hospitals where the choice between adequate pain management and patient death took about 40 seconds to become obvious. But she didn't say any of that. She just stepped back further and made herself smaller. Hargrove adjusted the fall rate himself, turning it down instead of up. Lowering the morphine. His reasoning would be documented later in his notes: patient responding well to conservative pain management. Avoid oversedation that might compromise respiratory function. It sounded excellent when you said it that way. It sounded like the careful caution of an experienced physician. But Ashley had seen the real reason in his eyes when he entered the room: the microscopic dilation of his pupils, the barely perceptible tightening at the corners of his mouth. She'd questioned his dosage calculation. She'd done it respectfully, in front of residents during handoff report, just 3 days ago. She'd violated the hierarchy. And he was punishing her the only way he could without it looking like punishment. Continue monitoring, Hargrove said, already turning toward the door. Let me know if anything changes. Of course, doctor. He left the room with the kind of exit that doctors practiced in medical school: not quite a walk, not quite a stride, something designed to communicate that he was busy and important and moving toward more critical things. The hallway outside room for 12 smelled like the bleach they used to clean the isolation curtains, sharp and chemical and covering something underneath. Ashley waited until his footsteps disappeared around the corner toward the nurse's station before she turned back to the colonel. His eyes had closed again, but his hand was clenched at his side. His breathing had gotten harder. She checked the monitor. His respiratory rate was 19 now. Climbing. The pain was overriding the sedation, pushing his body into a state of subtle distress that would build gradually unless someone intervened. She reached for the fall lock. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. She did something that violated protocol and hospital hierarchy and the direct instructions of the senior physician on the floor, and she did it with the same absolute certainty that had carried her through 9 years of classified deployments and 2 combat tours and a medical evacuation from Marja that had cost her everything she had. She increased the pain medication. Not dramatically. Just 0.5 milligrams of morphine, added to the fall line, timed with his breathing. Precisely calculated to bring his respiratory rate down without creating respiratory depression. Precisely the dosage she would have written if she had the authority to write anything at all. She documented it in the medication log, adjusted for patient comfort per vital sign response, 0650 hours, and then she moved to the next room like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just committed an act of insubordination that could cost her license. Behind her, in room for 12, the colonel's breathing deepened. His hand unclenched. His body found the mercy it needed. And somewhere in the ICU, in a moment that would matter more than anyone knew yet, Dr. Hargrove was already thinking about what he'd noticed in the chart. Something about the way the morphine had been documented. Something that didn't quite fit with the protocol he'd just mandated. Something that suggested a nurse who knew exactly what she was doing and had done it anyway. He was already planning how to use it. Monday morning at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like industrial coffee and the particular antiseptic that only hospitals could afford. The staff lounge was full, 6 residents clustered around the worn refrigerator, for nurses sorting through the schedule board, when Dr. Hargrove walked in with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. He was tall in the way that made shorter men straighten their spines around him, with the kind of jawline that suggested generations of people who'd never worried about money. His fraternity ring caught the fluorescent light as he poured his espresso into a ceramic mug with his initials engraved on it. "I'll bet anyone here $50 that our new nurse quits by Friday," he announced, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough that the entire room stopped moving. Some people just can't handle real medicine. The laughter came easy. Residents laughed because they needed his recommendations for fellowships. Nurses laughed because they needed their shifts approved. The sound moved through the lounge like a wave, and Hargrove smiled the smile of a man who understood that power wasn't about intelligence, it was about making other people nervous. Ashley stood at the coffee station, her back to the room, holding an empty mug with the hospital logo worn faint from 100 washings. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She poured the coffee, 2 sugars, no cream, the same ritual she'd maintained for 3 years, took one measured breath, and walked out without turning around. Behind her, Hargrove's smile widened. He'd been testing her composure, and she'd just failed in his calculation. Too perfect. Too controlled. Too much like someone with nothing to prove. That was the moment he decided to break her. Tuesday the cafeteria was packed. Lunch rush at 11:08 a.m. meant 300 people moving through the space in a specific chaos, residents mixing with custodial staff, nurses grabbing 15-minute meals between floor assignments, administrators pretending to belong to the world of actual work. Ashley sat at a corner table with her tray, Salisbury steak, green beans, a roll, reading a nursing journal about cardiac complications in post-operative patients. She'd positioned herself exactly where she always did, visible but isolated. Hargrove walked past like he was crossing the room for water. He didn't acknowledge her. He simply extended his arm as he passed her table, and his forearm connected with the edge of her tray with the kind of force that looked accidental if anyone was watching, but wasn't. The plate went first, clattering against the tile floor with a sound like a bell. Then the vegetables scattered across the ground in a green constellation. The roll tumbled. A piece of meat skidded underneath the adjacent table. 40 faces turned. The room didn't go silent, it was louder than before, everyone pretending they hadn't seen anything. "Slippery hands, Cooper," Hargrove said, without stopping his stride. His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who'd never experienced consequences. "You should get some grip strength." Ashley knelt on the tile without hesitation. A custodian moved toward her, but she waved him off with a single gesture. Her jaw tightened as she cleaned, a muscle jumping near her temple, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. She didn't speak. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply collected the scattered food and placed it back on the tray with the methodical precision of someone performing a task under observation. When she stood, her eyes were dry. Her face was neutral. Her hands didn't tremble. But Hargrove saw the muscle jump. He saw the moment her composure tightened like a fist. That's when he knew. She wasn't timid. She was restrained. There was a difference, and the difference was that restraint could break. By Wednesday, the campaign had shifted. It wasn't about public embarrassment anymore, that was too crude, too easy. This was about dominance. This was about establishing hierarchy in the way that mattered most, by making her choices for her. The nurses' station at 2:15 p.m. was crowded with the entire ICU staff. 2 residents reviewing charts. 3 nurses documenting vitals. A charge nurse coordinating admissions. The monitor banks beat their steady rhythm, and somewhere down the hall, machines kept people alive in the precise mechanical way that hospitals had perfected. Hargrove held a patient chart in his hand, the colonel's chart, Ashley realized immediately, and he walked directly to her workstation with the deliberateness of someone making a statement. He dropped the chart at her feet. Not handed it. Not placed it. Dropped it so the corner struck the floor first, and papers cascaded across the tile like a collapse. The room contracted. Everyone felt it. The charge nurse looked away. A resident suddenly became very interested in his phone screen. The other nurses found urgent reasons to check medication dispensers. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Hargrove said, his voice loud enough for the entire station to hear. "Maybe if you spent less time questioning doctors and more time doing your actual job, you'd understand why I ordered that dosage." Ashley looked at the scattered chart. She looked at Hargrove. She saw his face, the satisfaction in it, the confidence, the absolute certainty that she would break. Around them, the hospital continued its mechanical operations. Ventilators wheezed. Monitors beeped. The fluorescent lights cast everything in their white institutional glow. She knelt and began to gather the papers. That's when it happened. A single tear escaped, traveling down her cheek with the weight of something precious being lost. It was the first crack in her armor, visible and perfect, the moment Hargrove had been engineering for 3 days. But as the tear fell, Ashley wiped it away with her hand. She didn't look down. She didn't break eye contact with Hargrove. She finished gathering the chart, stood to her full height, which was several inches shorter than his, but somehow the space between them felt calibrated differently now. "My education isn't the thing you should be worried about, Doctor," she said. Her voice was different. Not louder. Not angry. Lower, actually. The kind of voice that comes from somewhere deeper than emotion. The kind of voice that had given orders in places where mistakes meant bodies. The kind of voice that had told people what to do when the alternative was death. The words had the precision of a weapon, and they landed with the impact of one. For just a moment, a fraction of a second that Hargrove would later wish he'd paid more attention to, she looked like something other than a nurse. But he was already moving past it. He was already building the next insult, the next strategy, the next calculated move to establish that he was right, and she was breakable, and the world worked in ways that suited people like him. He didn't see what she'd just revealed. He only saw a nurse who'd cried, and that was enough. What he didn't know was that she'd been thinking about the Colonel in room for 12. What he didn't know was that the Colonel had written a letter 3 months ago, a letter that started with, "If anything happens to me, make sure her son knows she kept me alive." What he didn't know was that Ashley hadn't cried because she was breaking. She'd cried because she was making a choice. She'd cried because staying invisible, staying safe, staying silent was starting to cost more than she could afford to pay. And what happened next, what Hargrove was already setting in motion without knowing it, would force her hand completely. The alarm started at 6:24 a.m. on a Sunday when the skeleton crew was just Ashley and 2 residents drowning in coffee. The Colonel's heart rate spiked from 88 to 142 in 8 seconds. Blood pressure dropped like a stone, 120 over 80, then 105 over 65, then 89 over 52 and falling. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, unchanged. Everything else screamed. "Get Hargrove," one of the residents said, but Ashley was already moving. She didn't run. Runners panic. She walked with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd treated blast wounds in field hospitals where speed meant the difference between a patient going home and going home in a box. The fall line was patent. The central line, the one Hargrove had placed himself 3 days ago, sat coiled in the Colonel's chest like a snake that had just woken up angry. The ultrasound was already warming. Ashley grabbed the probe, the coupling gel cold against her palm, and positioned it in the subcostal view. What she saw made her hands move on their own. The pericardial sac was dark. Fluid. 60, 70, maybe 80 cubic centimeters of blood pooling around the Colonel's heart like a slowly tightening fist. The right atrium was collapsing. Cardiac tamponade. The pressure was crushing his heart the same way a hand wrapped around a tennis ball crushes it. Every heartbeat was fighting against a vice that was closing millimeter by millimeter. "Call cardio," the resident said. His voice had that trembling quality that meant he was running the numbers in his head, time to surgery, time he didn't have, time that was already gone. "There's no time," Ashley said. 8 words. She set the ultrasound probe down and turned toward the supply cart. The resident made a move like he might actually follow protocol, might actually stand there and wait for Hargrove to shuffle in with his coffee cup and his arrogance. She caught his eye. Not with a look, with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change in the room. 14-gauge needle. Sterile field. Now. The resident moved. The second one didn't argue either. Fear and competence look the same when they're pointed in the right direction. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway at exactly the moment Ashley was prepping the insertion site. The xiphoid process. Fifth intercostal space. Subxiphoid approach, the safest angle, the one that gave the most margin for error when error meant puncturing the right ventricle and turning a salvageable situation into a code no one could walk away from. Hargrove took 3 steps into the room, saw what was happening, saw the ultrasound images, saw the darkened pericardial sac, and froze. His hand started shaking. Ashley had seen this before, not in hospitals, in field hospitals. Doctors who had training but no experience. Surgeons who could read textbooks but had never felt a patient die in their hands because they waited too long, because they followed protocol instead of following the patient's vitals straight toward the door marked mortality. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth. Closed it. His eyes darted between Ashley and the ultrasound screen like he was trying to solve an equation that was changing faster than he could calculate. Step back, Ashley said to no one in particular. To everyone. It wasn't a request. It was a command with the weight of 9 years of service hidden inside 2 words. Hargrove took 1 step backward without meaning to. The residents cleared the monitor. The room shrank to Ashley's hands, the needle, the ultrasound, and the colonel's heart that was running out of time. The needle went in. Not tentative. Surgical. Guided by the ultrasound like she was walking someone through a minefield with a map only she could read. The subcostal approach meant angling through the diaphragm and into the pericardial sac at precisely the right depth, no more, no less. She'd done this in a field hospital in Helmand province in 2011 with a dead light and a patient bleeding out from shrapnel wounds and nothing but her hands and muscle memory and the kind of training that didn't come from a textbook. It came from watching people die and then watching people live because you didn't hesitate. Because you didn't freeze. The needle advanced. 1 millimeter. 2. The ultrasound showed the tip like a bright white star moving through the black fluid. Then the hiss of air escaping. Then the blood. 60 cubic centimeters came out in the first draw. Dark, oxygenated blood that should have been inside the pericardium, giving the heart room to beat, instead of crushing it with every systole. The syringe filled. Ashley's hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. Her eyes stayed locked on the ultrasound screen, watching the pericardial sac collapse from a dark blooming flower into a thin line. Space. The heart's right atrium re-expanded. The monitor above the bed beeped once. Twice. The pressure wave smoothed out like someone had turned down the volume on Catastrophe. Heart rate came down from 142 to 119 to 104. Blood pressure climbed, 95/60, then 105/68, then 118/72 and stabilizing. The colonel's oxygen saturation didn't move because it had never dropped, but now it meant something again. It meant survival. It meant the next breath was going to come because the heart had room to pump again. The entire ICU watched through the glass. 3 nurses. 2 residents. 1 attending cardiologist who'd just arrived from her call room and stopped in the doorway like someone had bolted her feet to the floor. And Dr. Hargrove, whose face had gone the color of old paper, whose hands were still shaking, whose 15 years of institutional power had just become completely irrelevant because a nurse had walked into a room and done the thing he couldn't do. Ashley withdrew the needle. Sterile dressing. Tape. Documentation on the screen with the same calm handwriting she used for everything: vitals, medications, observations. Procedure performed. 60 ccs serous sanguineous fluid. Cardiac tamponade secondary to central line placement. Patient stable. The words didn't convey the thing that had just happened in this room. They were boxes on a form, not the difference between a Delta Force colonel seeing his family again and a code blue that nobody walks away from. His pressure's steady, one of the residents said. Not to Ashley. To the room. To himself. To anyone who needed to hear that the impossible had just become routine because someone who knew what they were doing had walked into a room when nobody else had answers. Hargrove left without speaking. He didn't look at Ashley. He looked at the monitor like it was a personal betrayal. He looked at the colonel like the patient had just proven something Hargrove couldn't deny, that some people operated at a level of competence that didn't need permission to save lives. That some people had done things in places that couldn't be talked about, and those things left a mark that didn't fade. That some people were more dangerous than they looked, and the danger wasn't cruelty. It was the absolute certainty that came from having already survived the worst the world could do. The cardiologist stepped forward. "I'll take over from here." "Good intervention, nurse." "Ashley," she said. "Quiet." Her voice had dropped an octave without her meaning it to. Not deferential anymore. Just matter of fact. The kind of voice people listen to because something underneath it suggested they should. The cardiologist nodded. "Good work, Ashley. Really good work." Hargrove made 3 phone calls before Ashley's shift ended at 2 p.m. The first was to Winston Chambers, the hospital board chairman and Hargrove's fraternity brother from Emory, made from his office with the door closed but not closed enough. Ashley heard the gist of it from 2 doors down while she was charting, something about liability, something about scope of practice, something about a nurse performing a procedure that required physician oversight. Hargrove's voice had that edge that meant he was spinning a story, rewriting what happened in that room into something that benefited him instead of the patient. The second call went to the Georgia Nursing Board. A formal complaint. Policy violations. Practicing outside her scope. The words were careful, professional, the kind of complaint that looked legitimate on paper even though the only violation was saving a patient's life instead of watching him die while someone with a medical degree stood frozen over an ultrasound. The third call was to a private investigator. His tone on that one was different. Colder. Transactional. 3-year gap. 2009 to 2012. Her references are instructed never to explain it. I want employment history, financial records, anything that suggests she wasn't doing nursing work during that time. And find out why the Navy records are so clean. Nobody's file is that clean unless somebody scrubbed it. Ashley finished her shift. Changed out of her scrubs. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one she'd kept despite every protocol officer who told her to burn it, destroy it, let Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper stay buried, pressed against her chest like a heartbeat that wouldn't quiet. But that wasn't the worst part. By Monday morning, there was a suspension letter waiting in her locker. Policy violations. Active investigation. Pending review. The hospital's official position was neutrality, but the subtext was written in Hargrove's voice, incompetence dressed up as procedure, malice disguised as protocol. Ashley read it twice. Didn't cry. Didn't call anyone. Just folded the letter, put it in her bag, and walked to her car. The parking lot was exactly what it always was, concrete, asphalt, the smell of diesel exhaust and rain that had fallen an hour before and left everything slick and reflective. Tuesday evening, while Ashley was sitting in her car outside the VA hospital in Charleston, 30 miles away, far enough that nobody from Oak Creek would see her, a Marine with a prosthetic leg and scars that ran down his neck like lightning bolts was sitting across from her in a waiting room full of veterans who had that look. The look of people who'd seen things they couldn't unsee, done things they couldn't undo, survived things they shouldn't have survived. The Marine's eyes locked on her face. Then on the faded unit patch just barely visible at the collar of her jacket. He started to smile. Started to say something. Then he caught the expression on her face, not anger, not fear, just a wall that went up like a fortification designed to keep the past outside where it belonged. The Marine turned away. Didn't say anything. Because some recognitions are dangerous, and some people carry permission to be left alone that radiates off them like heat from a fire. The phone started ringing before Ashley's shift ended. Dr. Hargrove stepped into the staff lounge at 3:56 p.m., closing the door behind him with the kind of deliberate precision that meant something was about to break. He dialed from the landline, no cell phone trail, no record on his personal device. The voice on the other end answered on the first ring. Winston Chambers, hospital board chairman, former Sigma Chi fraternity brother from Duke, a man whose influence over Oak Creek Memorial stretched back 2 decades through golf games and whispered favors. Hargrove's voice came out smooth, rehearsed, the voice of a man building a case brick by institutional brick. "Winston, we have a credentialing crisis. The senior nurse on my floor, Ashley Cooper, performed an emergency procedure this morning without proper authorization. Pericardiocentesis. On a critical patient. She essentially practiced medicine without a license." There was a pause on the line. Hargrove smiled. "I documented it. Multiple witnesses. The board needs to move on this before she harms someone else." The call lasted 90 seconds. The second call went to the Georgia Nursing Board's complaint hotline. Hargrove sat in his office with the door locked, voice calm and authoritative as he described how a nurse had overstepped her scope of practice, how she'd performed an invasive surgical procedure without physician oversight, how her actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, violated the fundamental structure of medical hierarchy. He cited the State Nursing Code Section 2 July, 43, Article 6b, subsection 4. He sounded like a man protecting patients. He sounded like a man doing his job. The complaint was filed at 4:12 p.m. Within 48 hours, the state board would flag her license for investigation. The third call took longer to arrange. Hargrove had a contact, a private investigator named Declan Moss who'd worked cases for hospital defendants before, a man who understood that some backgrounds needed examining. Hargrove provided the basics. Ashley Cooper, 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial, a resume gap so clean it looked edited. Previous employment at 3 different medical facilities, all references provided by people who'd been explicitly instructed. Hargrove was certain of this, never to explain what they actually did during those assignments. No social media. No photographs from before 2021. No family connections. No civilian past. The kind of absence that meant something, in Hargrove's experience. Something worth finding. "Look into her," Hargrove said. "Whatever she's hiding, I want it documented." The investigator's retainer was $5,000. Hargrove paid it from his personal account and felt it was the best money he'd spent all month. By Friday afternoon, it was finished. The suspension letter arrived at 7 a.m., printed on hospital letterhead, signed by Winston Chambers himself. Credentialing irregularities. Performing medical procedures outside scope of practice. Immediate suspension pending board investigation. The letter included language about protecting patient safety, about maintaining institutional standards, about ensuring that the hospital maintained compliance with state regulations. It was a masterpiece of administrative precision, each word chosen to make her removal sound inevitable, professional, necessary. Ashley read it 3 times in the break room before she cleared out her locker. The locker was a space she'd occupied for 36 months. 3 years of 12-hour shifts, 3 years of being invisible, 3 years of holding her past behind a perfect fiction of ordinariness. Everything fit into a single cardboard box from the supply room. Her spare scrub jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, so faded now that only someone who knew what they were looking at would recognize it as a Navy Fleet surgical team insignia. A photo of Marcus in his ROTC uniform, pride radiating off him like heat from a fire, a kid who didn't know his mother had been someone once, someone dangerous, someone trained. A coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in a font that had faded from the dishwasher. A stethoscope she'd owned since 2016. A bottle of lotion she used between patients. The small totality of a life she'd built to look like everyone else's. She didn't cry. The trembling that came, and there was trembling, wasn't from defeat. It was from recognition. Hargrove had moved exactly as she'd known he would, with the precision of a man who understood institutional power the way a sniper understood wind. He'd called the right people, filed the right complaints, hired the right investigator. He'd built a case that would hold up at any board hearing, would survive any legal challenge. Because the case was technically sound. She had performed the procedure. She had acted outside her credentialed scope. He'd taken her greatest strength, her competence, her instinct, her training, and weaponized it against her. The box was heavy for something that weighed so little. She carried it past the nurses' station, where 3 nurses she'd worked with for 36 months didn't make eye contact, and through the staff exit into a Savannah afternoon that smelled like rain coming and magnolias dying in October heat. Saturday morning, the VA hospital's waiting room was full of the people Ashley had spent the last 3 years avoiding. Veterans with the particular kind of stillness that comes from having survived things civilians don't know how to ask about. A man with a left arm that ended at the elbow, reading a month-old copy of Field and Stream. An older woman whose face suggested her son or daughter wasn't coming home from this appointment. A Marine with a gait that said IED aftermath, every step calculated and controlled. And scattered among them, the ones like Ashley, the ones with no visible wounds, the ones sitting too still, the ones whose eyes tracked exits and counted people on instinct. She was there for anxiety medication, which was technically accurate. The panic attacks had started 3 weeks ago, around the time Hargrove began his campaign, around the time she'd started understanding that the fiction couldn't hold forever. The VA doctor, a Navy Reserve psychiatrist named Dr. Patricia Voss, didn't ask about Oak Creek Memorial. She didn't ask about Hargrove or the suspension or the reason Ashley's hands had started shaking during medication administration last month. She just refilled the sertraline prescription and looked at Ashley with the kind of recognition that came from having served. "You're still carrying it," Voss said quietly, when the appointment was ending. "Yes," Ashley replied. "You know that's not sustainable." "Yes." The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and old coffee and the particular staleness that came from buildings designed to hold people who'd been broken and needed fixing. Ashley waited for her prescription, surrounded by veterans whose wounds she'd once treated in facilities that officially never existed. A field hospital in Marja. A casualty collection point in Helmand Province. Medevac transports with call signs instead of names. 9 years of deployments where she'd been Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, Fleet Surgical Team 7, where her decisions meant the difference between soldiers living and soldiers being loaded into flag-draped bags. 9 years compressed into paperwork marked classified, into service records sealed by national security protocols, into a past that the Navy had erased as completely as they could manage. The box in her car contained the last physical evidence of her civilian life. She sat in the waiting room, her prescription slip in one hand, her coffee, lukewarm from a pot that had been brewing since 6 a.m., in the other, and realized that Hargrove had done something he didn't intend. He'd forced a reckoning. In trying to destroy the nurse, he'd erased the buffer between who she was and who she'd been. By Monday morning, if the board heard that her references had explicit instructions not to discuss her background, if that private investigator found the gaps in her resume and started asking questions, the story would start coming apart. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd let it happen. She'd let Hargrove bait her into saving the colonel's life, into performing a procedure that would make her visible, into acting in a way that a normal nurse wouldn't act. She'd let 3 years of careful invisibility collapse in 30 seconds of muscle memory and muscle memory alone. And somewhere in the last 18 hours, between the suspension letter and this waiting room, between the empty locker and the box in her car, someone had made a phone call. Someone who recognized her. The fluorescent lights in the waiting room buzzed with the particular frequency that made her teeth ache, a sound that soldiers learned to hate, a sound that meant institutional spaces and waiting and time moving slower than it should. Ashley finished her coffee. She collected her prescription. She walked to her car through air that was already starting to feel different, like the barometric pressure was changing, like weather was moving in. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors at Oak Creek Memorial. No idea that the Pentagon had already unsealed classified records. No idea that the colonel had made a phone call to someone much higher in the chain of command than a hospital board chairman. No idea that everything she'd buried, every medal locked in a shadow box in her attic, every operation that had been classified into non-existence, was about to become very, very real. Ashley was clearing out her locker when Marcus pushed through the staff entrance carrying something that stopped the world cold. A shadow box. Wooden frame, glass front, the kind you see in military homes and veterans' bars. His hands shook as he walked toward her, his 16-year-old voice cracking in a way that made every nurse in the corridor turn. "Mom, they need to see these." He didn't understand the weight of what he was holding. He didn't understand that everything she'd spent 3 years burying, every name redacted from official records, every operation that had been classified into non-existence, was right there in his trembling hands. The shadow box contained medals. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Navy Commendation Medal. Her dress blues folded with surgical precision. Unit insignia. All of it. The hospital administrator's conference room smelled like stale coffee and the particular panic that comes when institutional power collides with the truth. Chairman Chambers sat at the head of the table, his fraternity brother confidence already fracturing. Dr. Hargrove occupied the corner chair, the same corner where he'd stood 3 days ago announcing his $50 bet that she'd quit within a week. 2 FBI agents in dark suits occupied the remaining chairs like sentinels. And Ashley stood in her scrubs, the jacket with the faded unit patch now visible to everyone in the room, while her son stepped forward with the shadow box. Marcus's voice shook. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, United States Navy." The words hung in the recycled air like a detonation. 9 years. 3 combat deployments. She was the senior medical officer for Task Force 121 operations in Helmand Province. He opened the shadow box. She saved lives in places that didn't officially exist. And she came here to be invisible because that's what the Navy told her to do. The charge nurse, Patricia, who'd worked beside Ashley for 2 years, stood next. Her personnel file trembled in her hands as she read. Major operation, classified until now. Emergency medical operations, Sanjin Valley. Forward surgical team deployment, FOB Shank. Commendation for lives saved under direct fire. The file states Senior Chief Cooper performed emergency procedures on 247 combat personnel with 0 fatalities attributed to medical error. 0. Patricia's voice cracked. The file also states she was ordered to cease all military affiliations upon civilian assignment and maintain complete operational security. She looked directly at Hargrove. It says right here that any investigation into her background without proper clearance would constitute federal interference with classified personnel. The colonel rolled in on a wheelchair. His chest still bore the faint surgical scar from the pericardiocentesis that had saved his life 72 hours ago. He wore his dress uniform, desert tan, insignia perfect, the bearing of someone who'd commanded men in Marja and survived to remember every face that had kept him alive. His voice carried the weight of command. Bronze Star with Valor. That's the first one. Hargrove's jaw clenched. Purple Heart, twice. 2 separate combat wounds. The colonel paused, letting each sentence breathe. Navy Commendation Medal for Medical Excellence Under Fire. And the last one, his voice strengthened with each word. Navy Cross. For actions in Marja that preserved the lives of 18 soldiers and 1 intelligence officer. She performed a cricothyrotomy in a bunker during mortar fire with 0 anesthesia and steady hands. Hargrove's face drained. Not because he was ashamed. Because he understood, in that moment, that every institutional leverage he'd spent 15 years accumulating had just evaporated. The board chairman he'd cultivated looked away. The nursing board complaint he'd filed would be withdrawn within hours. The private investigator he'd hired was about to receive a very serious phone call from the Department of Defense. The FBI agents exchanged a glance. The older one, Special Agent Morrison, slid a classified briefing folder across the table. The Marja operation is being declassified as part of a terrorism prosecution currently in federal court. Senior Chief Cooper's testimony is required. Her civilian employment with Oak Creek Memorial is hereby classified as approved military assignment. Any action taken against her personnel status on the basis of false pretenses constitutes federal interference with active classified operations. He paused. An attempt to obstruct evidence relevant to federal prosecution. That's when Marcus Webb walked in. The hospital IT director. A former Marine who'd served 8 years before a knee injury pushed him into civilian work. 3 weeks ago, he'd noticed something during routine equipment maintenance, a patch sewn inside Ashley's jacket lining. 75th Ranger Regiment colors. He'd seen that patch exactly once before, on his commander's jacket in Kandahar. He'd put 2 and 2 together and waited. Watched. Understood that Ashley Cooper was the real deal and that Dr. Hargrove was about to make a catastrophic mistake. Webb carried a hard drive like it was ordnance. Sunday afternoon, Dr. Hargrove submitted a work order requesting deletion of security footage from ICU room for 12, citing patient privacy concerns. Webb's voice carried the precision of someone trained to brief command. Hospital policy requires preservation of all footage pending administrative review. I preserved everything. He connected the drive to the conference room monitor. The footage played in silence. There was Ashley, moving through the crisis with the kind of fluid precision that comes from having already survived the worst. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing stayed controlled. The needle went in at the correct angle. 60 ccs of blood drawn from the pericardial sac. The monitors responding. O2 climbing. Heart rate stabilizing. Sinus rhythm re-established. And there was Hargrove, frozen, hands shaking over the ultrasound, completely incompetent in the moment that mattered. Then the footage shifted. Sunday evening. Hargrove entering the IT department with his forced smile. Monday morning. Hargrove again, more insistent this time. I need that footage deleted. Patient privacy. Webb had documented every interaction. Every request. Every lie about why the footage needed to disappear. I forwarded all of this to the state medical examiner and the board's legal counsel yesterday, Webb said. His voice carried the weight of evidence. The deletion request, combined with the quality of care documented in the footage, suggests consciousness of guilt. The administration will need to address whether Dr. Hargrove was attempting to destroy evidence of a medical emergency he mismanaged. Chairman Chambers stood so fast his chair scraped backward. David, did you attempt to destroy evidence of a medical event? It wasn't a question. It was the moment everything changed. The nursing board would withdraw the complaint Tuesday morning after the FBI contacted them. By Wednesday, the state medical board had opened a formal investigation into falsification of incident reports. Thursday brought 3 former residents filing complaints about hostile work environment and retaliation. Friday, the private investigator Hargrove hired received a personal phone call from someone at the Pentagon explaining that investigation of classified military personnel without clearance constituted federal offense. By the following Monday, Hargrove's medical privileges were suspended pending investigation. The fraternity brotherhood that had protected him for 15 years evaporated like morning rain. The residents who'd watched him humiliate a civilian nurse suddenly remembered every incident with clarity, every insult, every public cruelty. The hierarchy he'd spent a decade building collapsed the moment the protection underneath it disappeared. But that wasn't the real punishment. That came 6 months later. Ashley stood at Oak Creek Memorial's front windows in her navy dress blues, the fabric sharp enough to cut glass, the insignia positioned with military precision. She'd just returned from a Pentagon ceremony where the Secretary of Defense had personally thanked her for 9 years of service that had never officially existed until her 16-year-old son decided that invisibility was too high a price for heroism. Outside the window, across the street in a strip mall parking lot, Dr. David Hargrove sat at a folding table with a banner reading affordable supplemental insurance. No stethoscope. No white coat. No hierarchy. Just a man in business casual, straightening brochures that didn't need straightening, watching patients walk past without making eye contact. A woman approached the table. She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds, then looked at her phone and kept walking. He didn't even try to stop her. Inside the hospital, staff gathered in the auditorium as Ashley pinned her new credentials to the board. Director of Emergency Medical Services. The position she'd been qualified for all along. The position she never would have been offered if the truth hadn't shattered the institutional politics that had kept her invisible. The colonel, fully recovered, stood beside Marcus. His voice was clear. Senior Chief Cooper's service exemplifies the highest standards of military medicine. Oak Creek Memorial is honored to have her expertise. Through the window, Ashley watched Hargrove load his folding table into the back of a 10-year-old sedan. The shadows were lengthening. The parking lot was emptying. The world was moving on without him. Marcus asked if she felt vindicated. Ashley didn't answer right away. She reached up and touched the unit patch on her new office wall, the faded unit patch that had been sewn inside her jacket lining, the patch that a Marine veteran had recognized in the silence of routine maintenance, the patch that had changed everything. "Your commanding officer told me something in Marja," she said finally. "True class is what you do when the lights go out." Dr. Hargrove built his career on what people could see: titles, hierarchy, connections. But character is what remains when all of that's stripped away. Outside, the sedan pulled out of the parking lot. Inside, Ashley Cooper began her first shift as Director of Emergency Medical Services, the role she was actually meant to fill all along. The role that required not just medical knowledge, but the kind of quiet authority that only comes from having commanded under fire, from having made impossible decisions in impossible moments, from having carried the weight of lives that depended on your steady hands and steady mind. That's what it looks like when the truth finally arrives. Not with fanfare or vindication speeches. Just the slow, inevitable destruction of everything built on lies, and the quiet rise of what was always real. What would you do if you had a secret that could change everything? If you'd spent years making yourself invisible, only to discover that heroism demands to be seen? Drop a comment below and tell me, did Hargrove get what he deserved, or should the reckoning have gone further? And if the Pentagon called your workplace tonight, would you answer? Subscribe for more stories about the ones who carry impossible burdens in plain sight.